I must apologize that this will be in English rather than Turkish. I hope it will be understandable. The talk, Toros Jeolojisi Development of Concepts, 1970s to Present, is jointly with my co-authors, Osman Parlak and Timur Ostomer. At this meeting so far we've had a huge amount of data. We haven't had a huge amount of interpretation. Now we're going to have a talk which is all interpretation with no data, but the data are in the background. The data are not forgotten. So, I'm an academic geologist. I work at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. I've been coming to Turkey, other regions for many years. And I would like to thank the organisers for inviting me to this meeting, both MTA and TPO. And as an academic geologist, I would like to thank MTA for interest and support since my first fieldwork here in 1976. Obviously, all of us in academic geology depend very heavily on the geological database which is provided by MTA and TPO. These are essential aids to research by the academic community. And always when we're in the field, we are using the MTA maps and the published guides, sometimes unpublished information when we can get it. And this is essential background. And we've had many, many enjoyable joint excursions and fieldworks together. For example, here we are, MTA camp in Kumluja in 1977, including Mustafa Chanel and my colleague Nigel Woodcock, or on the Tauride conference in 1977 with Nesbitt Ozgul and others discussing the Haddon map. And really, when this map came out, it was a very big advantage. So thanks to MTA in particular. Now, in focusing on 1970s onwards, I am not discounting the huge amount of important work, fundamental work, that went on before that time. Only that time is limited and we look at this younger history, which really began with the plate tectonic revolution about 40 years ago. Now, this was one of my first introductions to Turkish geology. It was the famous textbook by Brinkman, published in 1976. Actually, data was older than that. And in this, we see the classic geosynclinal concept of Turkey, in which we have a series of tectonic units or zones, which were essentially static. There were no major displacements of units. And in fact, geologists in Turkey, right up till 1985, were arguing with us in the field that map tectonics was not important in Turkey. But in fact, the plate tectonic revolution gave us good reason to believe that major structural displacements have taken place in many regions such as Anatolia. Now, of course, seafloor spreading, the Vine and Matthews hypothesis, really started the thinking that ocean crust formed at spreading ridges might be found on land. And this was quickly followed up in the Eastern Mediterranean with Ian Gass's concept that the Trudosophyllite formed at a spreading ridge. And in the 1970s, there was a whole decade, really, when people were starting to apply plate tectonic models in Turkey. We shouldn't think they just started afterwards. I particularly highlight the work of Robert Hall and Roger Mason, published in 1976, where they travelled right out from UK to Bitlis, eastern Bitlis. They mapped and detailed the region, and they restored the geology here as Arabian foreland and a passive margin, subduction zone with upper Cretaceous, high pressure metamorphism, accretion and mélange formation, with the Bitlis Massif to the north. They saw this basin as essentially closing near the end of the Cretaceous. So actually this is quite similar to what many people, not everybody, many people think today. Around the same time, myself and colleagues working in southwest Cyprus were able to restore the geology there in terms of Triassic rifting, development of a passive margin, seafloor spreading, and by 1976 we had extended this into southern Turkey in the Antalya unit, and we were able, by the time of the 1977 Izmir conference to Yeska conference, to develop this in terms of a southerly rift basin, becoming a spreading ridge system, we now call the Southern Neotethys, with a major flip to northward subduction in the late Cretaceous, collision by the Miocene and the present setting. So in some but not all interpretations, this approach remains quite similar to what we may think today. However, these interpretations had limitations. They were all rather localized. And this is where Celal Şengör's contribution was quite spectacular, and it largely benefited from his well-known training with John Dewey and Kevin Burke in Albany. And he combined this with, in particular, Yücel Yılmaz's huge knowledge of Turkey, especially the Pontides, and this enabled them to make the first plate tectonic model for the whole of Turkey in famous milestone paper, 1981, and then Şengör et al. 1985. We all know about these models, but I just highlight several points. For the late Triassic, the concept of southward subduction, the concept of the Gondwana margin rifting into a number of blocks with a series of small ocean basins, fundamental switch in the late Cretaceous with northward subduction and the emplacement of ophiolites onto several margins. Interestingly, in eastern Anatolia, they inferred southward subduction, a point I'll come back to later on. Recently, Şengör and colleagues wrote that they still support this model 100%, well, 99%, with one significant exception. They later recognized that the Kırşehir block could be considered as a separate macrocontinent with a separate ocean basin behind. They called the inner Tauride Ocean. And this ocean remained present right up until about the middle Eocene time. So this is the famous paper by Najib Gürer et al., 1984. However, if we look at the literature, we find that in fact many key aspects have remained controversial, and we'll look at some of them in general time order. Oldest first. I'm not going to go back older than about the Carboniferous. I'm going to have to be selective. And basically, I'm indicating the problems. I'm not indicating the answers. And my idea giving this talk was mainly for the younger generation who are going to inherit these problems and have to solve them. Unfortunately, there are not too many of you here. I think maybe you're mainly interested in neotectonics. So very briefly we'll touch on these issues. And I'm only talking about the Taurides, Anatolides. Was the late Paleozoic a divergent or a convergent system? Is the early Triassic similarly divergent or convergent? Should we see the Taurides and Anatolides as a single crustal block or amalgamated during the late Triassic relating to closure of Paleotethys? When did the Tauride-Anatolide platform suture with Eurasia? Should we consider a single Tauride-Anatolide platform, or were there multiple platforms? We've heard that thrusting from north to the south in Upper Cretaceous to Eocene is generally or universally accepted, but there's been much more discussion about Antalya and Alanya units in the south. Did a Neotethys actually exist in southeast Turkey between Arabia and Bitlis crustal units or not? And was there an additional ocean, you may call the buried ocean, between Malachi and Bitlis-Putragate crustal rocks? Did an inner Tauride ocean really exist? And the famous Upper Cretaceous supersubduction ophiolites, did they form in just one basin or in several basins? So these are some 10 key questions which we'll touch upon very briefly. I'm emphasizing alternatives and not necessarily indicating preferred solutions. Starting with late Paleozoic, there is difference of an opinion whether the north margin of Gondwana was divergent or convergent. According to Stampley et al., this was a passive margin, and we heard yesterday from Damien Altiner that his reconstruction of the Permian would be very consistent with this as a rifted passive margin with an active margin to the north. On the other hand, another school of thought envisages this as an active continental margin in the late Paleozoic. I've mentioned a few key papers here in which we have arc magmatism, back arc basin development, and so on. We've looked at this more recently, and there is growing evidence that there has been northward subduction. Some people disagree with this, but if we consider going right to the Caucasus and right through into the Balkans, it seems very reasonable. However, it does not now look as though the north margin of Gondwana was entirely passive. We have the evidence of these mélanges, we've called the Konya complex, which suggests that at least during the late Carboniferous, this is likely to have been an active margin. And the important results of Jandan et al. For these late Carboniferous granites within the Anatolides do point to southward subduction. So there is quite a strong possibility that actually we may have double subduction, dominantly northward subduction, Devonian, Carboniferous onwards, but during the late Carboniferous in particular, there are strong hints that there was southward subduction going on. So following on from that was the early Triassic, the Permian, and then the early Triassic divergent or convergent. And again, we see very different opinions. Many geologists, and probably the majority, would suggest that the north margin of Gondwana was active. It was continuing from the late Paleozoic, associated with arc magmatism, marginal basin development, either just locally or more regionally, as suggested in this interpretation. The reconstruction we've heard a lot about from Necdet Özgül. This could be quite consistent with a rifted passive margin, but I note that in his abstracts he indicates that he prefers a model similar to this with back arc rifting in the Triassic. On the other hand, some time ago, Parlak and myself and some others, following on from Damien Altiner's work, really argued this could be considered as a rifted margin from the Permian, Triassic, and spreading in the Jurassic Cretaceous without it being an active subduction system. And interesting, this interpretation was adopted by, or also suggested by Jandan et al., who viewed the Permian and then the Triassic as passive or rifted type margins. So we've got strong divergence of opinion here. The further debate has been whether the Taurides and Anatolides should be considered as a single crustal block, or were they separate but only amalgamated during the late Triassic related to closure of Paleotethys to the north. Now, in the famous diagram of Okanentusis, Aralakai and Okanentusis, we see a concept of the Anatolides and the Taurides is essentially as a single crustal block. Many people clearly believe this. On the other hand, there's been a different school of thought with, for example, Patrick Smoix and others arguing that the Taurides and Anatolides were fundamentally different blocks until early Jurassic time. and this was explained by Stamfley and colleagues as the result of northward subduction, whereby the Eurasian margin, represented by Anatolides, rifted away as a marginal basin and drifted southwards until it collided with the until it collided with the Taurides and as a result produced a major collision zone during the Kimmeridgian so-called orogeny. And this was particularly taken up by Erin et al., and they developed an interpretation which involved this northward subduction, Anatolides and Taurides coming together until a collision in the late Triassic. Well, this has been tested. We heard from Damir Altiner yesterday that probably the faunal data, especially fusulinids, doesn't obviously support this. But the basic geology doesn't either. If you go to the Kavramların Peninsula or the Greek island of Chios, you can find sedimentary sequences that go through the Triassic, straight through into the Jurassic, some cases in the lower Cretaceous, without any stratigraphical or structural break. So there really isn't any geological evidence of this so-called collision. And we can reasonably conclude that the Taurides and Anatolides have evolved as one block. So if we assume this, when did Eurasia really first suture with Gondwana? And here again we find quite a range of opinions. For example, Jamal Gonchadou has published the idea that collision essentially occurred in the early Triassic, and this was followed by rifting to create the Izmir-Ankara Ocean. So really quite an early collision. On the other hand, Schenker and Yilmaz envisaged subduction continuing much later, so the collision is really not until late Jurassic, early Cretaceous, and the Izmir-Ankara, or for them, northern Neotethys, opens after that time. On the other hand, another school of thought argues that no such collision ever occurred, and that the whole of the Paleotethys remained essentially open right the way through the Mesozoic. Indeed, it's evolved from Paleotethys by subduction into Neotethys by spreading, so it was still open, at least in the late Cretaceous, and probably indeed into the early Tertiary. In such case, the first collision of really Eurasian units with Gondwana was not until the early to Middle Eocene. So we see a wide diversity of opinion here. Another issue is the Tauride-Anatolide platform. Okay, we take them as a single unit, but does that mean it was just one geographic entity, or was it multiple entities? And here it's interesting to look at how the paleogeographic maps of the areas have developed, especially the French-led project, first Jean Decour, and then Eric Barrier, as both maybe and more recently Darius projects. And when you look at the reconstructions, you find there's a tendency towards more paleogeographic complexity and variety with time. So probably we should no longer think of the Tauride-Anatolide block as just a single continuous entity, but in fact has much more paleogeographic variation. We first got hints of that in southwest Turkey in the early days, when we saw that in addition to the major Beydalara platform, there are a lot of marginal highs and platforms, and Çalbalada and Bakırlı'da are examples. And early on we restored these as marginal platforms and highs along the rifted margin of the southern Neotethys. And working in the Eridir area, John Waldron, doing detailed mapping and structural work, was able to show that the main, effectively, Gate Dar was separate from a marginal platform, the Duluk Dar. And he restored in 1984 the Esparta angle as a series of carbonate platforms and blocks, not widely separated. They'd all be in the same faunal province, if you like, of Demir, but nevertheless, as with a fairly complicated and variable paleogeography. And that pattern, I think, has been extended more recently. If we look at the area further west in the western Taurides, it's widely recognized that in addition to Tafshanli and Afyon platform, many people have inferred a separate Dilek platform. This may require to be further tested in the field. And when we go to eastern Anatolia, I don't think you can just take the Gate Dar and prolong it all the way through East Turkey into Iran. We are seeing marked paleogeographic differences. For example, the Malatya unit is full of Upper Cretaceous granites. As we all know, we don't see anything like that in the Gate Dar of the central Taurides, and Bitlis and Putige may have been separate blocks. So we have to look for quite considerable paleogeographic variety and complexity, and a lot more work of this sort, I think, needs to be done. Now, in terms of the emplacement, we've heard that everybody accepts that Balker, Haddam and Boskia were thrust from north to south during the Upper Cretaceous and early Tertiary. So this is Lishgert Osgo's reconstruction we've seen so many times, moving from Upper Cretaceous through to Eocene. There's two ways of looking at this. One is that these were pulsed events, and work that I did with Peter McIntosh in this same area, we recognized the first Upper Cretaceous event related to suprasubduction zoonophyllite placement, a second event early over by mid to late Eocene, connected with collisional tectonics, almost certainly final closure of the ocean base to the north. And then we have Miocene tectonics as seen in the Aksu thrust in the southwest. These seem to be discrete thrust entities. However, a different view has been put forward recently by Peter McPhee and others. They've made the first balanced cross-section across the western part of the Tauride belt. This is challenging, but is interesting. And they regard the amount of shortening in the region as enormous at depths, and they regard it as a continuum of contraction that went all the time from the late Cretaceous all the way through to Miocene or Pliocene. So two different views, this pulsed event-based approach and this sort of continuum thrusting approach. Shortening has definitely occurred. We know this from global plate reconstruction, but where that shortening was taken up is a debatable issue. So again, there's a lot of points here about how the Taurides should be reconstructed. But we're all agreeing that the emplacement was north to south. But there's been no such agreement when we come to this Antalya unit or the Alanya unit further south. And here there's been a very strong point of view that in fact these southerly units such as Antalya were part of these thrust sheets emplaced from the north in the Upper Cretaceous. This was particularly argued by Jean Marcoux and also by Luc Emmanuel Ricou. As his reconstruction shows here, interestingly they accept the Kershire block as a separate intraoceanic block, but they have no southern neotethys at all. However, as early as 1976, 1977, and combined with the work of André Poisson, it became clear that down in the southwest area in particular, we were dealing with a rifted passive margin that was emplaced generally westwards or northwestwards. Completely different direction from these more northerly naps. And in fact, in the Eridir area, John Waldron's detailed mapping showed that the Upper Cretaceous imbrication was towards the northeast, and it was overridden and superimposed by Eocene emplacement from the north or northeast. And that's really where this confusion largely arose. Yes, there has been important southward thrusting effect in these southern units, but that is not the initial Upper Cretaceous emplacement. It relates to the superimposed Eocene emplacement. And another very important line of evidence brought out by Jella Senghor in particular was when we look at the marginal platforms around the Esparta angle. The Bala Da is a good example. Commonly the sedimentary sequences go right the way through the Upper Cretaceous into the early Tertiary without structural break. There's so many of these platforms, it's very difficult therefore to emplace large holocronous units across them and through them without leaving any stratigraphic record. Also important, brought out by Olivier Monod first, was that in this Guzelsu corridor area, the southern margin of the Gate Da is full of ophiolitic debris and other clastic material of latest Cretaceous age, which is not seen in the central or northern Gate Da. That's easily explained by northward emplacement of the holocronous rocks in the Upper Cretaceous. So, coming to Alanya unit, this has also been quite controversial. Some people have wanted to link it with the Tafshanli zone, but the geological context doesn't really support that. Marku and others again published structural data which pointed to southward emplacement of the Alanya Massif, and there has been southward events such as related to the Hadim Nap emplacement, but that is not the dominant emplacement of the Alanya Massif. And instead, as Leshkidozgo pointed out, the dominant emplacement is essentially northwards, which took place in the early Tertiary. And Metin Kaplan and others followed this up by looking at the metamorphic, dating the metamorphic rocks of the Alanya Massif. And they particularly envisage a situation with the Alanya Massif as a continental block, which was thrust downwards and northwards beneath this Alanya-Bitlis ocean. Actually, there's a bit of a problem with this, because how do these ophiolitic rocks then get onto the Gate Da in the Upper Cretaceous? This point was particularly taken up by Osman Parlak and myself recently, and we essentially interpreted the Guzelsu and Talia rocks as a marginal rift, which was essentially driven northwards as a flake. So the main driver is northward subduction of a large continental block and Alanya, but a consequence of that is to detach the margin, the Antalya complex rift rocks, and thrust them northwards onto the platform. We think that's the most plausible explanation what's happening there.
Sorry, Mr.
So I'm getting on quite well. I've only 2 more points or so to make. So moving out to eastern Anatolia, we have the important question of whether we have a southern Neotethys in this region or not. And in the famous reconstruction of Evgen Yazgan and others, we see that there's no actual need for any southern Neotethys ocean here. And in some more recent work, where an ocean basin has been reconstructed to the north, again, we see no suture zone here for the Bitlis Putuge, or to the south of the Bitlis Putuge Massif. So this is one point of view.
Sorry, Mr. Robertson, the time over.
Okay, I need to quickly just finish the last few points, because I'm getting there. I should say that Perenjek and Oskaya envisaged southward subduction here, which was incorporated by Schenker and Yilmaz. But a strong dominant point of view has been northward subduction here between Arabia and the Bitlis Massif, and that this has continued into the Tertiary. And particularly strong evidence comes from the metamorphic rocks, especially in the hanging wall of the bitless Putige unit, which strongly suggests that there was a subduction environment to the south of the bitless Putige unit. So if we accept this northward subduction, we should see that there are many interpretations of when this ended. Some people think that collision occurred in the late Cretaceous. Some people think it occurred in the Eocene with the recipient collision, as recently suggested. Other people think the ocean was still open into the Eocene, or indeed right into the Oligocene. And in fact, most people will, however, agree that by the mid-Miocene, we have strong collision and uplift in this area. But the timing of collision is still very much up to debate. Is there additional ocean further north between Malachi and bitless crustal rocks? Barrier, think a minor rift. But it seems we need a larger ocean up here to explain the ophiolites that are in place beneath the Tauride block. And it's been suggested that bitless and Putige are essentially floating fragments with a buried ocean to the north. More evidence for this ocean comes from the high-pressure metamorphic rocks in the bitless, but not the Putige, which are most easily explained by deep underthrusting of this beneath the Tauride platform unit. So my last 2 points are the question back to the Kershey here. Was it really a microcontinent? And recently, Kershey and Tafshanla have been correlated as a part of a marginal rift by some workers. On the other hand, Kershey has been interpreted as essentially a floating ocean block with a supersubduction zone ophiolites forming between them and the Taurides. There's also evidence for upper Cretaceous arc magnetism in the Kershey block, which may relate to northward subduction. However, the paleomagnetic data of Combe-Lefebvre and others introduce complications here because they do suggest there may have been eastward subduction in this area, which is difficult to fit into any setting. The last of my points is the upper Cretaceous ophiolites. Did they form in just one ocean basin or in several? Well, several ocean basins models have been suggested, but Stamfli and Borel suggested a single supersubduction zone slab. This was supported by Marco Maffioni and the others, with the idea that a single slab rolled back, broke up into pieces, and then was emplaced all over the place as multiple units. Does the asthenosphere really behave like this? Can rollback really occur like that? This is an open question. So my conclusions, I haven't attempted to produce any new paleotectonic maps. If you do that, you have to get all of the choices, such as I've mentioned, correct. It's clear the best models come from field-based studies. I think that multidisciplinary interpretations are generally better than just single interpretations. We've talked about 2D models, but these may be suspect. We shouldn't forget the potential importance of strike slip and terrain displacement. We shouldn't forget just how much has been lost by subduction and collision. Clearly, we need to go back to the field, and we need especially to test the existing models, not just assume them or confirm them, fundamentally test them, and that will be mainly the job of the younger generation. Thank you, and sorry for slightly overrunning.